intention of fighting her.
I knew exactly what I was doing. Everything that I did that night, I knew what I was doing. And I think I was taking things out on her that had happened to me.
It is therefore ordered that you shall be put to death.
She enters the courtroom smiling, waves to relatives, as if on a stage where she's the star, sits before the judge convinced that nothing would happen to her. But upon hearing her sentence, she was destroyed. This is the case of Christa Pike. And to understand how this teenager was the youngest woman to get death sentence, we need to go back a bit in time. If you like real criminal cases, subscribe to the channel to not miss any video. There are silences that bring no peace. There are silences that are actually the weight of something that should not have happened. In Knoxville, Tennessee, the winter of 1995 didn't bring only the biting cold that hardens the earth. It brought a discovery that would freeze the soul of that community forever. Imagine a January morning, the type of morning where the vapor of breath is the only proof that you are alive. A pair of joggers, seeking the invigorating routine near the University of Tennessee Agricultural Campus, notice something that doesn't belong to the palette of dead colors of winter. Scarlet stains, vibrant and terrible, contrasting with the dry leaves and the gray asphalt. They didn't know, but they were following a breadcrumb trail left by a mind that no longer inhabited our common reality. The trail led into the woods, to a clearing that, until that night, was just a forgotten corner. There, what they found wasn't just a body. It was a manifesto of hate. A young woman, almost a child in eyes of law, lay disfigured. The face, once full of plans of a computer student from Florida, was now a mask of trauma. The skull showed catastrophic fractures, and on chest, a symbol that evoked ancestral fears, a pentagram, the five-pointed star, carved with a precision that denoted time and dedication. A part of head bone was missing. Someone had taken a piece of her. That was Colleen Slemmer. She was 19. And what forensics would find in the following hours would reveal that her death wasn't fast, nor painless. It was a spectacle of cruelty that lasted nearly an hour. But to understand Colleen's end, we need to understand the start of who held the blade. A few miles away, the Knoxville Job Corps Center functioned as a promise. It was a place of second chances, designed for youth that life had already tried to down. It was where children of broken homes, youth without perspective and dreamers seeking a technical trade crossed paths. Among them was Christa Pike. At 18, Christa didn't look like a predator. Raised under the shadow of neglect, with an alcoholic mother and the void left by an absent father, she carried a history of instability that many would see as a cry for help. However, the system rarely hears whispers until they become screams. Christa wasn't alone. In the closed ecosystem of Job Corps, affinities form by similarity of pain or of darkness. It was there that she met Tadderell Shipp, only 17 years old. Shipp was the perfect complement for Christa's void. He didn't talk of nursing or of future jobs. He talked of demons. He talked of rituals, of power and of a spiritual hierarchy where the oppressed could, finally, be the masters. Together, they created a bubble of isolation fueled by a mutual obsession and by a growing interest in occultism. Shadala Peterson, a girl seeking acceptance, orbited the couple, becoming the silent witness and accomplice of a paranoia that grew like a tumor. The motivation, if we can call it that, was tragically mundane. Jealousy. Christa convinced herself that Colleen Slemmer wanted to steal Tadderell. There was no proof, there was no logic. In Christa's mind, Colleen was an intruder in her sanctuary of shadows. The idea that Colleen might be interested in Shipp transformed into a malignant obsession. Christa began to vocalize her hate. She didn't just say she disliked Colleen, she said she wanted to teach a lesson to her. She wanted to show who was smarter. That Thursday, January 12, 1995, the plan was put in motion with a terrifying simplicity. Under the pretext of making peace and smoking something off campus, the trio lured Colleen into the trap. Colleen, perhaps wanting only to end the tension between them, accepted. She walked voluntarily into the dark, trusting that she'd return to her dorm in a few hours. She didn't know that Christa carried with her a box of razor blades and a hate that no conversation could appease. While walking toward the clearing, the tone of conversation changed. The air became heavier. Christa's accusations began to come out like lashes. Colleen tried to defend herself with words, but Christa had already decided that night was not for dialogues. It was for sacrifice. The isolation of woods guaranteed that the screams wouldn't be heard. Job Corps, with its faulty security and its hallways full of youth worried about their own problems, didn't notice the absence of the four. What happened in that clearing transcends common crime of passion. It was a ritual of dehumanization. Christa didn't want just to kill, she wanted to destroy Colleen's essence. While blades cut the victim's flesh, Shipp and Peterson watched or acted as restraint. Colleen begged. She spoke. And that, curiously, was what most irritated Christa. Years later, she'd say in testimony, "It's hard to hurt someone when they are talking to you." Christa's solution wasn't stopping. It was telling Colleen to shut up so the work could continue. The brutality reached the peak when a piece of asphalt, heavy and cold, was used to strike repeated blows against Colleen's head. The sound of bone breaking mixed with the silence of night. And then the trophy. Christa wanted a part of Colleen. She wanted to possess the moment forever. With the coldness of one completing a puzzle, she removed a fragment of victim's skull and kept it in coat pocket, wrapped in a napkin. Upon returning to the dormitory, the adrenaline still rushed through Christa's veins. She wasn't in shock. She was exultant. She showed the piece of bone to other students. She laughed. She mimicked Colleen's moans. That night in Knoxville, 3 youths went to sleep with the blood of a classmate on their hands, while the city still had no idea that evil had gained a new face, an 18-year-old face, with eyes that showed no trace of soul. But the trail of blood left in the woods was just the beginning. What Christa didn't realize is that, by taking a piece of Colleen with her, she had also signed her own fate. The pride she felt for the crime would be the rope that justice would use to encircle her. But how would police manage to connect apparently ordinary teenagers to a crime with satanic overtones in less than 72 hours? The answer was hidden not only at the crime scene, but inside the pocket of Christa Pike's coat, and in a killer's inability to keep her secret guarded. The sun that rose in Knoxville on January 13, 1995, did not bring clarity, but rather the start of a bureaucratic and forensic nightmare. While Colleen Slemmer's body was processed by experts under the cold lights of the morgue, police began to profile who would have the capacity, and the willingness, to carve the chest of a young woman and take part of her skull. Initially, authorities feared the worst, a serial killer or a cult group operating in the shadows of the University of Tennessee. The ritualistic nature of the crime, with the pentagram and the missing bone fragment, pointed to something much more planned than a simple street fight. However, arrogance is, often, the ruin of the criminal. While detectives isolated the clearing, at the Job Corps dormitory, Christa Pike was far from hiding. On the contrary, she seemed to be in a state of post-traumatic euphoria that bordered on the messianic. She didn't just keep Colleen's skull fragment, she treated it like a relic. Reports from students who were at the center that morning describe a talkative, almost magnetic Christa Pike, who invited classmates to see something. What she showed, wrapped in a bloody paper, was the piece of bone that, as she herself said laughing, fit perfectly in that bitch's head hole. The report didn't take long. A mixture of fear and nausea took over the students. A young woman called her parents, who immediately contacted the police. The names of Christa Pike, Tadrill Shipp, and Shadala Peterson began to circulate on patrol radios. What investigators found when questioning Job Corps staff was a trail of administrative neglect that allowed Christa's hate to grow without supervision. Colleen was missing from attendance records, while the trio had returned to campus with dirty clothes and erratic behavior the night before. On January 15th, just 3 days after the crime, Knoxville police made the arrests. What most impressed the Homicide Division veterans was not the resistance of the youth, but the absence of it. Upon being taken to separate interrogation rooms, the group dynamics began to fragment, revealing the hierarchy of horror they had established. Shadala Peterson, the group's lookout, was the first to break. With eyes swollen from crying, she detailed how the plan was hatched, how the blades were bought, and how she just watched while the couple turned Colleen into a piece of meat. But it was Christa Pike's testimony that entered the annals of American criminology as one of the most disturbing ever recorded. Sitting before detectives, with a face that still retained traces of adolescence, Christa denied nothing. She didn't use the psychotic break or self-defense alibi. With a calm voice, sometimes interrupted by small laughs of scorn, she described the sensory pleasure of the attack. She detailed the sound of asphalt hitting Colleen's skull, the way the victim tried to babble words of plea, and how that irritated her deeply. "I wanted her to shut up," she repeated, as if the victim were the aggressor for daring to suffer in her presence. The search of Christa's room sealed her fate. Besides the piece of skull, the definitive physical evidence that linked the body in the woods to the suspect in the dorm, officers found a shrine to the occult. Books on Satanism, drawings of goats, candles, and notes on how to channel energy through others' pain. For Tadderel Ship, the 17-year-old boyfriend, that was an extension of his gang identity and his distorted spiritual quests. For Christa, it was the tool she used to validate her hate for Colleen. The media impact was immediate and overwhelming. Knoxville was a conservative city, deeply religious, and the idea that Satanism had reached its doors through federal government teenagers generated a collective hysteria. TV cameras surrounded the courthouse at every preliminary hearing. The image of Christa Pike being escorted, sometimes smiling for cameras, sometimes displaying a frigid indifference, became the symbol of a lost generation. The press nicknamed her the Pentagram Killer. While prosecutor Bill Crabtree prepared the case, he realized he wasn't dealing with a common crime. He needed to convince a jury that this 18-year-old girl was not a victim of circumstances, but a mastermind of cruelty. The defense, led by public defenders, began to dig into Christa's past, trying to humanize the monster. They brought up the childhood of abuse, the mother who abandoned her in bars, the sexual traumas and emotional instability. The argument was clear: Christa was a broken product of a broken system. However, Christa herself seemed to sabotage the efforts of her defense. In letters sent from prison and in recorded conversations, she maintained the tone of someone who didn't regret the spectacle. She was proud. She felt powerful. For the first time in life, people were afraid of her, and she loved that feeling. The stage was set for one of the fastest and most visceral trials in Tennessee history. The question was no longer if she was guilty, but rather how severe society would be with a woman so young who refused to show any shred of humanity. The verdict seemed certain, but what happened when the judge read the final sentence would change United States legal history. Christa Pike would discover that the power she thought she had over life and death was about to be taken by the state, and her reaction in court would be the only moment when the mask of ice would finally start to crack. This third part dives into the tension of the courtroom, into the confrontation between the image of the broken girl and the ritualistic predator, culminating in the historic moment of the sentencing. March 1996. The Knoxville courtroom was not just a hall of justice. It was the epicenter of a moral trial that paralyzed the state of Tennessee. The air was heavy, charged with the expectation of hundreds of people who squeezed in to see Christa Pike. The contrast in court was disturbing. On one side, the Slemmer family, carrying photos of Colleen, a young woman with light eyes and sweet smile, whose future was cut short by a senseless obsession. On the other, Christa, now 20 years old, sitting at the defense table. She no longer looked like the wild teenager from prison photos. Her lawyers dressed her in conservative clothes, tried to soften her gaze, hoping the jury would see in her a lost child instead of a calculating killer. But the prosecution, led by Bill Crabtree, had a weapon that no image strategy could nullify: Christa's own voice. When the recordings of her confession were played in court, the silence was absolute. The jurors heard, in excruciating detail, as she described the sound of Colleen's skull splitting under the weight of asphalt. They heard her laugh while telling how Colleen begged for her life. Each phrase was a blow to the defense's thesis. It wasn't the account of someone in a breakdown. It was the account of someone who savored the memory of total dominance over another human being. The defense strategy was to focus on what they called a perfect storm of trauma. Mental health experts took the stand to map Christa's devastated psyche. They spoke about frontal brain damage, about borderline personality disorder, and mainly, about the childhood of abuse that would have left her unable to process emotions normally. She wasn't born this way, they argued. She was forged in the fire of abandonment. They tried to paint Tadderel Ship as the occultist architect who had manipulated Christa's fragility, transforming her jealousy into a ritualistic bloodlust. However, the jury couldn't look away from the trophy. The piece of Colleen's skull, presented as evidence, was the physical proof of a cruelty that surpassed any sociological explanation. That was not an act of impulse, it was a collection. The carving of the pentagram on the victim's chest suggested a dedication to suffering that lasted too long to be just an emotional blackout. The prosecution was relentless. Christa Pike knew exactly what she was doing. She chose the clearing. She chose the blades. She chose not to stop when Colleen asked for mercy. After just a few hours of deliberation, a surprisingly short time for a death penalty case, the jury returned. The verdict of guilty of first-degree murder surprised no one. But what came next was the true turning point. In Tennessee, the decision on capital punishment lies with the jury. They had to decide, Should Christa Pike spend the rest of her life in prison, or should she be executed by the state? On March 30th, 1996, the decision was announced. Death by electrocution. In that instant, the mask of coldness that Christa wore throughout the process finally shattered. The young woman who had laughed at Colleen's death, who had kept a human bone in her pocket, collapsed in convulsive tears. "Please let me hug my mother before I go," she screamed between sobs that echoed through the marble walls of the court. It was the only moment when Christa Pike seemed, to the public, a human being, but it was a humanity awakened by the fear of her own death, not by remorse for the death she caused. The sentence made Christa Pike a grim landmark, the youngest woman in the United States to be sentenced to death since 1976. While she was handcuffed and taken to the maximum security unit of the Tennessee Prison for Women, the world outside debated the weight of that decision. Tatterall Shipp, because he was only 17 at the time of the crime, escaped execution by a matter of months, being sentenced to life in prison. Shadala Peterson, who cooperated with the police, received a sentence of probation. The imbalance of the penalties generated outrage. How could the boyfriend, who encouraged the ritual, have a chance at freedom, while the girl who held the stone would be fried in an electric chair? For the Slemmer family, there was no imbalance. There was only the justice possible for a crime impossible to forgive. But, as happens in many death penalty cases, the reading of the sentence was not the end. It was only the beginning of a new and bizarre phase. Christa was sent to death row, but the prison bars were not enough to contain her volatile nature. Isolation, instead of bringing reflection, seemed to ferment an even greater darkness, proving that, for Christa Pike, violence was not an isolated incident, but a language of its own. Years after being sentenced, while the world tried to forget her name, Christa Pike would prove that the prison walls were too thin to contain her impulses. A new brutal attack and a cinematic escape plan would reveal that the pentagram killer still had chapters of horror to write, and that death row was just her new stage. To enter death row is to enter a suspended state of existence. For Christa Pike, the bars of the Tennessee women's prison did not represent the end of her story, but the beginning of a long and disturbing metamorphosis. While judicial appeals began to slowly move through the appellate courts, the public expected that isolation would bring remorse or, at least, silence. However, Christa soon proved that the darkness that led her to that clearing in 1995 had not been left behind. She was still a force of nature, unstable and dangerous. In 2001, 5 years after her conviction, Christa Pike's name returned to the headlines for reasons that chilled the blood of prison authorities. Even under constant surveillance, she managed to attack another inmate, Patricia Jones. The method was almost as brutal as the original crime. Christa tried to strangle the woman using a shoelace, nearly succeeding in completing the act before being restrained by guards. The attack had no clear motivation, other than the pure manifestation of power and violence. For prosecutors, it was the ultimate proof that Christa was not a young woman who made a mistake under pressure, but a predator who saw aggression as her only form of interaction with the world. Christa's life in prison became a paradox. On one hand, she was the most famous inmate in the state, receiving piles of letters from admirers and the curious from all over the world, a common phenomenon in true crime cases, where the figure of the killer exerts a morbid fascination over the public. Among these correspondents was Donald Kohut, a man who fell in love with Christa's misunderstood girl image. This relationship evolved from letters to an escape plan worthy of Hollywood scripts. In 2012, authorities discovered a conspiracy involving Kohut and a prison guard, Justin Heflin. The plan was simple and audacious: take Christa out of prison by force or through bribery. The plan was thwarted, but it served to solidify the dark legend of Pike. Even locked up 23 hours a day, she still managed to manipulate men to serve her desires. Meanwhile, the battle in the courts turned into a war of attrition. Every decade, a new hearing. Her lawyers, funded by groups opposed to the death penalty and by state resources, presented new evidence of her mental instability. They argued that the original jury never had full access to the extent of her brain damage and the devastating impact of her upbringing. There were moments when Christa herself seemed to give up. In one of her most volatile episodes, she signed documents waiving all her appeals, asking to be executed immediately. "I just want this to end," she said. Months later, she changed her mind, resuming the fight for life with a fierce tenacity. Today, in 2026, Christa Pike is a woman of nearly 50 years old. The face that the world knew, that of the teenager with soft features and cold gaze, has given way to a physiognomy marked by decades of fluorescent light and confinement. She has spent more time on death row than in freedom. Colleen Slemmer, if she were alive, would be the same age. And it is here that the most painful point of this narrative lies: time. The time that was stolen from Colleen and the time that was given to Christa through a legal system that, although it decreed her death, seems unable to execute her. The legacy of the Pike case is an uncomfortable mirror for American society. It raises questions that we still do not know how to answer. Is the death penalty justice, or just institutionalized revenge? Can a childhood of extreme abuse serve as a mitigating factor for an act of pure sadism? The case forced profound changes in how Job Corps operates and how at-risk youth are monitored, but the open wound in Knoxville never fully healed. The clearing where Colleen took her last breath is today a place of silence, but for those who know the story, the wind through the trees still seems to carry the echoes of that night in 1995. For Colleen Slemmer's family, the justice promised in 1996 has become a shadow that haunts them. They are forced to relive the crime with every new appeal, every new documentary, every time Christa Pike's name returns to the light. For them, Christa's execution would not bring Colleen back, but it would bring the closure of a cycle of agony that has lasted 3 decades. Christa Pike's story is not just about a ritualistic murder, it is about the failure of multiple systems. The family system that abandoned her, the educational system that did not see the signs, and the legal system that remains in an infinite impasse. She remains the last woman on Tennessee's death row, a living relic of an outbreak of violence that the country never managed to forget. As we close this dossier, there remains the image of Christa in her cell, a woman who sought power through the death of another, and who ended up finding a different type of death, the slow death of waiting. In the end, perhaps Christa Pike's greatest punishment is not the electric chair or lethal injection, but the fact that she has to wake up every day for 30 years, being exactly who she is, knowing that the trophy she kept in her pocket did not bring her power, but only eternity in a cold cell. The case of Christa Pike ends as it began, in silence. A silence that does not bring peace, but that forces us to look into the depths of the human soul and recognize that, sometimes, horror has no explanation, it just exists. And if you want to know more cases like this one, subscribe to the channel and wait for the next ones.